Hi, my name is Jack. I'm one of the designers on Force of Virtue along with my brother Sam, but today I'll be helping you learn the game and get a bit of an introduction. Force of Virtue is a skirmish game based in 15th century Italy around the time of the rise of the Borgias. You have the Medici, you have Da Vinci, you have a lot of these weird things going on, a lot of variety in weapons and warfare as people try and figure out how to use these new technologies, but there's also armor and the old kind of knightly class that is clashing with these new things. So in this game, you arm your people, you give them the training, the special cards, you can use intrigue, strategy, you can poison each other, you can do a lot of the fun stuff that you have that you'd expect from kind of Borgias and mercenaries fighting over the ruins of Rome at the time. We'll be using cards to build our forces and using virtues and all the kind of elements that we've blended together from the historic period to kind of give you a genuine feel of what combat is at the time, because all of the design team are historical fencers and historians and martial artists, and we really want to kind of give you a feel of this. So we'll dive into the rules and see what you're interested in. Okay, so we're going to get into the basics, what we mean with some terminology and some of the very fundamental aspects of the game. So first of all, we're going to start with the concept of decks. So in Force of Virtue, you build your force using cards, not points or anything like that. Everything you take in the game is represented on a card that has its rules, its stats, everything like that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about, in the rules, sometimes we use certain terms that are going to be important for understanding what we mean. So, first off, the difference between a D6 and a D3. Very fundamental for this game. When I say a D6, that means roll a six-sided dice, and you read the value on it. 2, okay? If the rules say a D3, I roll the dice and I divide it by 2, rounding up, so that 3 is actually a value of 2. If I were to roll a 5, it would be a value of 3, and a 2 would be a value of 1, okay? So we'll be using that for movement and certain other things. Next, another important term is the difference between a simple roll and a virtue roll. We'll be talking about the virtues differently later on. So, a simple roll means it's a normal dice, okay? Numbered 1 to 6. A virtue roll means that it uses one of the 4 virtues that is at the core of the game. Okay? Now these are modeled on the 4 virtues of a fencer based on the fencing treatise of the fencing master Fiore de' Liberi. They also, if you're a scholar of medieval or Renaissance history, they also correspond quite nicely to the humors, but the animals make a lot more sense than the humors. Okay? So you either have a simple roll or a virtue roll. When you're rolling a virtue roll, whenever you get a crit success represented by one of the animal symbols, that will correspond to a virtue crit on the tables that we will see later on, which are specific to certain actions. If you get an X, that means it is a crit fail. Crit fails also have specific effects based on the virtue that you are rolling and what you're doing. Now, usually, you will be able to choose, when you're doing a roll, you'll be able to spend multiple virtue or to roll multiple dice. We will explain, when we get into activations, we'll explain this a little bit more, but let it suffice to know, if I spend multiple virtues to make multiple rolls, I roll dice equal to the virtue I spend, and I choose the better result, or the result I prefer. So, if I roll 3 dice, and I get a crit on one of them, a crit success on one of them, then I will likely choose the crit success. If I roll multiple crits on multiple dice, then I can choose the crit success that I prefer. That will depend on the situation, and that's a lot of where the skill of the game comes from. If I roll multiple dice and I get a crit fail on all of them, then of course I'm stuck with having a crit fail. But I can choose which crit fail I use. Which one is the worst case scenario preferred depends on the situation, and you'll have to judge that as the player. If I roll multiple virtue dice and one comes up a crit, well, I would highly suggest, since you can choose the result you prefer, that you not choose the crit. Who knows, that might be what you want, but it's unlikely. Now, even on a simple roll, whatever the roll is, a 6 is always a success, and a 1 is always a fail, no matter the modifiers involved. Okay, now that we've gone through dice and the basics of dice, we're going to talk about the cards. The cards are very important to Force of Virtue. So you have 5 different types of cards. You have logistics cards. Logistics cards carry troops, weapons, physical objects. These are what you build and you put on the table. You have honor cards. Honor cards are the training and special advantages your troops might have due to how they were raised, where they grew up, how they were trained, the circumstances, whatever. You then have intrigue cards. Intrigue cards are sly, underhanded ploys that you might use to gain an advantage on an opponent. Then you have strategic cards. Strategic cards are strategic advantages that your warband might have gained through previous maneuvering in order to allow them an advantage in the game. The last card is virtue cards. Virtue cards are what give your capos, your leader, what we call leaders in this game, the virtues that they will use to command troops. We'll talk a little bit about that and how virtues interact and why it's so important for your force that it has virtue. Without it, nothing really happens in this game. What the card system allows us to do is it allows you to build a force that is tailored to your play style and to what kind of warband you want to represent on the table, and it also allows you to represent things like ambushes, shortcuts, deployments, special advantages, even your leader's personality and what scenario rules might be in play for that game quickly and easily. You will be able to create scenarios, create warbands, all just by drawing cards, and you will have the rules easy to hand and easy to check. It also allows us to mix and match and have a deck building aspect, whether you want Swiss, French warband that is mixed and maybe combined a little bit of the cultural aspects, or having different types. Another important basic concept is rounds versus turns. In Force of Virtue, it is a I go, you go system. So players will take turns taking actions until a round is over. So let's say I start the round with my action. My opponent will take their action, and then I will take my action. When we are done taking our actions, which will be defined by what troops we have and what the circumstances of the situation are, one of us will decide to pass. That ends the round for me. I'm not able to take any more actions with my troops. I am able maybe to play cards and card effects, but I am not allowed to move my models or activate them in any way. My opponent will eventually, when he is done, pass. The player who passes first has first action on the next round. At the beginning of a new round, all models and cards are restored to their full actions that they have on the value of their card, and any virtue that are spent, which we will discuss later, are restored to fresh. This is a card from a nation deck. A nation deck represents where your troops come from or where they were trained. That will give each nation has pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. Currently in this first edition we have Swiss, French, Spanish, Landsknecht and Condottieri, which are of course the Italian mercenaries that are roaming around. You also have character decks. Character decks are there to give your forces flavor. Dogs of war make your troops dastardly mercenaries out for no good. Harsh, disciplined, or maybe not. It gives you a few advantages, a few honor cards, things that might tailor your force to represent how you want them to play. There is also Renaissance Man for an enlightened view of warfare. And Born to Battle for your knightly nobles who have come here to represent the ancient ways of doing things. There's also Fires of Faith for your religious zealots or heretics. The last deck type that we have is called a scenario deck. The scenario deck is a deck that you use to build your games, and you can also draw from for tips and tricks in order to deal with your opponent's list if you don't have a specific answer that you feel really helps you from your nation deck or your character deck. It can help you, say, for example, if your enemy likes to run lots of guns, you can play a card that makes sure it's raining when you attack so that it will negate the power of their black powder so your knights don't get their heads blown off. So, quickly, how to read cards. So because each card has different signals and when to play it, right? So, for example, here we have a strategic card. Now, you see up on the top left, it is hidden. That means you hide it from your opponent until you play it. Underneath it says discard. When it says it means discard, that means you have it, and then to play it, you take it out and show it to your opponent. The opposite of a discard card is an attach card. An attach card is attached to a card before the beginning of a game. A discard card you hold in your hand until you play it. So it's not attached to a card. I can play it on any card at any time. The last element is how long the effect lasts. Here you see the dice symbol means it lasts for the whole game. The instant symbol means that the card is an instant effect and only lasts for that moment that you played for that specific effect. The next option is for an action. Actions will be explained later under activations and actions, but suffice it to say it lasts only for them. Then you have rounds. This card affects an entire round. A warning shield means that that card has a special timing and a special lasting effect. You will have to read the card text in order to find that out. Now I'm going to show you how to read a logistics card. A logistics card has its subtype, then it has the model's stats. The name of the card, usually a weapon option. These are either or. And then it has the number of models that accompany, that you put on the board when you take that card. We will be getting to a more specific understanding of the stats as we go through the rules, but I will give you an overview of what the basic stats mean. Faith is how many virtue dice during a round that model can use or be affected by. Actions is the amount of times that this model can take an action during the round. The 2-hit value represents the skill of that particular model. The armor represents how well armored the model is, and you will use for resisting both attacks from fighting and shooting. Your wound represents how hard it is to kill this model once the armor has been pierced. The weapons usually have special effects depending on what you're arming them with. Troop subtype can be important for card effects at certain points. Here we have a different type of logistics card. This is also a model, as you see down here, but it is a capo, a leader. They also have a command range. Your command range is what you check in order to see whether they are able to give troops orders, as in activate the troops to make actions with them. If you have a command range of 0, you will not be able to lead other troops, but the capo will be able to have virtues attached to them and move itself and activate using its own virtues. Another type of logistics card is an equipment card. Equipment cards are attached to normal troop cards. This replaces an aspect of the troop card's own card. For example, here I'm equipping 3 mercenaries with either heavy crossbow or an arquebus. That means that each of those 3 models, or one of those models, however you prefer to distribute this, has a heavy crossbow or an arquebus. You can split this however you wish. If you wish to have 2 models with an arquebus and 1 model with a heavy crossbow, that is within the rules. For example, you also have equipment cards that can manipulate the armor save. For example, now, this would replace the armor save on the model. So now, instead of a 5+ save, we have a 3+ armor save. This can be useful for making your troops more resistant to damage and preventing them from burning virtue. The 5th type of card is a virtue card. A virtue card is something that you attach to a capo. See the capo subtype under logistics card. These give that capo the virtues that are represented on the card. We will discuss later how these virtues are used and manipulated. I've mentioned a few aspects about the virtues. The virtues are very important for playing this game. It's the lifeblood of the game. It's the currency, it's your morale, it's how you make activations, and how you will win or lose this game. The core of the system are your capos. To your capos, you will attach virtues. These 4 virtues correspond to the 4 virtues that the fencing master Fiore de Libri decided were important or crucial to a fencer. They also correspond to the 4 humors in medieval thought and medicine, which is how they described human personality, human action, even how they got sick and survived, how they fought, how they thought. Everything about life was, in some ways, often portrayed back to the humors and woven into religious mysticism. When sources that we find look at for medieval warfare, and especially small unit combat, they don't care so much about the weapons that troops are using. What they talk about is these troops attacked audaciously, or they had fortitude in their defense, or they were prudent in the execution of whatever they were doing. So these virtues allow you to kind of describe the actions in these terms. It also gives you flavor for your capos, it gives them a personality. This one is fast, but prudent as well, or this one has great fortitude and physical strength, and is also audacious. It will also mean, when you give your orders, that your troops understand what you mean, your tone of voice, the feeling, the intent. Here, you see that this capo from the Condottieri deck has been equipped with 2 speed and 1 prudence. The speed is the ferocity and the sheer physical speed of your capo and their willingness to kill and deliver damage. This capo is ferocious and vicious, but he also has prudence. He's got an eye for what's going to happen. He finds small chinks. He's accurate and observant, but a little bit more vicious than he is prudent. To represent this on your card, you can either use dice or tokens. These dice and tokens are important so that during the game you understand what you have used and what you have not. Because as things go on, your capo, be he a banner, a knight, or a character, will be activating, which we'll talk about later. But in order to activate, you spend your tokens. If you're using your tokens, we suggest you move them off the card to show when they are spent. Through damage and special effects, virtues may become burnt. The difference between burnt virtue and spent virtue is that burnt virtue stays burnt until you rally. Spent virtue returns to you at the beginning of the next round. This spending of virtue and burning of virtue differentiates between the focus of your leaders and capos getting spent ordering troops and being spread out among the different things that they are doing, expending their willpower to make things happen in the chaos of battle. Burnt virtue is when your troops lose courage and lose faith in the leadership, or the capo maybe loses faith in his own ability to handle the situation. If you have no more capos on the battlefield with unburnt virtue, at the end of the round, you will lose the game. Therefore, it is very important that you make sure that you manage your virtues prudently. Quickly, I want to talk about another basic, measuring and basing. I know it sounds somewhat mundane, but it's useful to cover. In Force of Virtue, we prefer to base our miniatures on a 25mm base. These are fairly common with most manufacturers. If you are using 25mm bases, you will measure from your model's edge to the other model's edge. If you have different models in your collection that are differently based on larger or smaller bases, you can measure from your model's head to the other model's head. This means that if you have different size bases, there will be no inconsistencies in measuring and no unfair advantages. If this is how you want to play it because of your bases, please discuss it with your opponent beforehand. Next, I want to talk to you about activations. During your turn, you will activate your troops. There are 6 possible types of activations you can use on your troops. Movement, shoot, fight, rally, reload, and interact. We'll go through each one individually. To activate, you will need Virtue. A capo that has a command range of 0, like the banker here from the scenario deck, can only make activations himself using his own Virtue. He cannot make an activation that includes other troops. Whereas a knight can make activations with troops around him. Same goes for a banner. To make an activation, you will take some of the tokens off your card to show they are spent, and you will roll the dice for whatever activation you do. You will then choose the better result. If you roll multiple dice and receive multiple crits, you may choose the result. Depending on what activation you're doing, you may either use Virtue dice or simple dice, as described in the basics video. 3 interactions use Virtue dice and have crit successes and crit fails. Fight, movement, and shooting all use Virtue dice and have crit successes and crit failures depending on which Virtue you use. All have crit failures and crit successes depending. Reload still uses Virtues to do, but does not have a crit success or crit fail chart. For the chart, see the rulebook. When a capo makes an activation, including other troops, all troops must do the exact same activation with the same dice. A troop or model can only be activated as often as the actions value on their logistics card. Over the course of the round, they may only be activated by a total number of Virtue dice equaling their faith. Think of it this way. Virtue is the currency that you can spend. Actions are the amount of opportunities you have to spend your Virtue. Faith is the total amount that you're allowed to spend during a round. A capo does not count as using his activation to activate other models unless he does the activation with them. If this knight were to make an active movement activation with these halberdiers to move them to the other side of him to block an attack, then that would not count as a movement activation for the knight, because he did not take part in the movement. If he were to move alongside them, then he would count as having used a movement activation. The same goes for any other form of activation. If at the end of a round, models are not within the command range of a capo with unburnt virtue, the models are removed at the end of that round. This means that they have fled. Maybe it's because these mercenaries have ended up a little bit too far out of the command range of whoever has been sent to make sure that they do their job, and they've slipped away quietly in the chaos of battle, saving their own necks. Or through morale loss, they have decided to flee. So the first activation that I want to cover with you is movement. Movement is, of course, core to the game. So here we have a capo with a knight right next to a banner bearer. The knight has a command range of 3. Measuring from the base, the knight is just out of command range of these 3 halberdiers. So instead, we will use the banner. The banner, for sake of argument, also has the same virtues. Now, these models are all within 6 inches of the banner bearer, measuring from the base to their base. So, he'll make a movement activation using 1 prudence and 1 speed. Movement is 3 plus d3. So again, a 1 or a 2 would be 1, a 3 or a 4 would be 2, a 5 or 6 would be 3. In advanced rules, you can also use the armor value of the card plus d3. This can also sometimes help with mitigating the effects of armor. But for now, we will keep it simple and move 3 plus d3. Excellent. We have a speed crit. A crit success on speed means that the models move an extra 3 inches for a grand total of 9. Now, in movement, the 1 roll you make applies for every model. So every model has the option of moving up to 9 inches. Again, measuring from the bases. Now, I will move these guys through here. Models cannot move through other models' bases, but we'll just say that these guys moved ahead. Now, I'll keep them all a little bit close together because I don't want things getting too scattered. So now we have a nice little group, and the halberdiers are able to support the 2 capos up front. Let's say we have here the banker who has 2 prudence. He is here trying to move up to join them, but there's an enemy capo over here. For the sake of argument, he wants to make a movement to go join these guys and get behind a little bit in protection. If, for the sake of argument, he rolled 2 Prudencia crit fails, we would refer to the chart and we would find that the Prudencia crit fail is moving directly away from the nearest enemy. So I'll measure from the base and move away from that enemy capo who's standing right there. If he had been moving Audacity, he would have had to move directly towards that enemy capo. Let's go through the rest of the crit effects. let's go back to the crit successes for a moment. A crit success in speed is something that the dice very generously gave us for free. However, let's go through the other crits. A crit success in prudence would mean that they would get a defense dice while moving as they sneak prudently around watching for enemies that might take a pot shot at them. That would give them defense dice as if they were moving through cover. A crit success on audacity would mean that any enemies that are within 6 inches at the end of their move, say for example, this enemy capo, is so frightened by their audacious entrance onto the battlefield that they are frightened and are at risk of losing virtue. They would roll a dice for every virtue that is attached to their card, and any result of a crit fail would immediately burn a virtue of that type. A crit success in Fortitudo means that the virtue and faith that were used for that movement are refunded, but not the action. Going now to the crit fails. If, say, the banker here were trying to move and join these people here, and he were to roll a prudence crit fail, that would mean that he would have to move 4 inches directly away from the nearest enemy, say this capo here. Imagine from the base, I move over here. Now he is dangerously out in the open and isolated from his protection. If he were to roll an audacity crit fail, he would have to move 4 inches directly towards his enemy. A speed crit fail means he would have to burn a virtue. He's gotten a little bit too hasty, stumbled, or out of breath. A fortitude crit fail means that he only moves 1 inch. He's just a little bit too stoic and tough about this. Next, I would like to go into the idea of difficult terrain. Let us say, for example, this card here would be counted as difficult terrain. Maybe it's a swamp, maybe it's a steep hillside, maybe it's a river or some rocky ground. Difficult terrain needs to be agreed before the game by both players. When crossing difficult terrain, each point of movement is halved. So if, for example, the Duchess here was moving across this rocky patch of ground, if she were to roll, let's say, a result of 4, she would then move 3 plus d3, meaning a total of 5 inches normally. But moving over that card, that is halved. So she moves those 2 inches count as 4, and she moves another inch beyond. For advanced rules on dangerous terrain, see the rulebook. The next activation that I want to cover with you is shooting. Here we have a little bit of a situation set up. We have these arquebusiers here ready to shoot at this line of halberds and pikes. Now, these halberds and pikes are currently out in the open. The first thing to talk about is targeting and line of sight. In Force of Virtue, we use what is called true line of sight. This means you try and get a bird's eye view of the model and check, can this model actually see? You can either do this with your eye or a little piece of string. In order to target another model, you need line of sight. That line of sight cannot be obscured by a wall, a building, or importantly, a friendly model. If when drawing line of sight from your model's head to the opposing model's head, it crosses the base of a friendly model, or what would be the base of a friendly model on a 25mm model, you may not target the enemy. However, an exception. If the model is in base-to-base contact with the firing model, they may fire over the other one's shoulder. This, however, only goes one model deep. For example, this arquebusier over here would not be able to target the Duchess. The rules on targeting are fairly simple. A model, when shooting, must target the nearest unobstructed enemy model. If there is less than an inch difference between the two models, the player that is being targeted may choose which model. Remember, this is unobstructed model. Right now, these models would target this front row of halberdiers. If these halberdiers were obstructed by terrain, this model, when resolving his shooting attacks, would resolve them against the banker, who is now clearly out in the open and an easy shot. A model counts as obstructed if at least a third of the model is covered, and especially if any bit of the body or head is obstructed. Arms or weapons do not count. On to how to resolve the shots themselves. Here, these three arquebusiers are being activated by this capo here. He's going to ask them to fire with a Celeritas, a Fortitudo, and a Prudence. Important to resolving a shooting action is the to-hit value. The to-hit value is represented by a 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5 plus etc. That number represents the number you have to roll in order for the hit to count as successful. So he's doing a 3-dice shooting activation with these three models. They will be targeting this front row of halberds. For each arquebusier, I will roll dice, virtue dice, equal to the virtue spent of the types spent. So I will first declare which model I am rolling for, and then the defender will choose which model of the ones within a 1-inch tolerance is getting targeted. I will now roll my dice and resolve the hits to see if any of this shot hit. This mercenary on his card has a to-hit value of 4 plus. The 3s do not hit, but the 5 does. Now we would go on to the armor save. The armor save is also represented on the model's card. This mercenary is shooting with an arquebus. The arquebus, as you see, has a range value and a extra added bonus. Now, of course, before shooting, I can check and should have checked whether he was in range. Now, I of course know that we are well within the maximum range of 18 inches. However, as you see on extreme range, they receive a +1 to their to hit value. That means instead of hitting on a 4 plus, they would hit on a 5 plus. enforce a virtue when you see a plus or minus on a card that is always referring the stat on the card. The value on the base card is improved by that. This halberdier's armor save, he would normally be rolling a 5+. That means it needs a 5 or more to succeed. However, that value gets +2 for the arquebus's penetrative power, making it a 7. We would now move on to the wound save. Now, before we move on to the wound save, first, however, we'd have to burn a virtue of a capo within whom's command range this model is. Now, the banker has a command range of 0, so we can't burn it off the banker. But we can burn it off this banner bearer here. So this banner bearer would have to burn a virtue on his card. He will have to rally that back. He won't get that back at the end of the round. Now we will move on to rolling for that wound save, which again is a 5+, which he fails. If a model fails a wound save, you may burn another virtue off a capo within whom's command range the model lies in order to re-roll this result. Considering he is but a lowly halberdier, I will not do that. I'd like to go through the different shooting crit results. If this next arquebusier rolls and gets a prudence crit, then he would be able to choose which targetable model he would like to target. Now he sees that the banker is out in the open and the banner bearer is also somewhat visible. He would then be able to choose which of these valuable targets he would be able to prioritize. This means that the soldier has, in the heat of battle, seen a valuable target and singled it out, knowing that if he can take this target out, it will sway the battle in his side's favor. Now, he will decide to shoot at the banner bearer. The banner bearer, of course, controls all these troops here, as the banker has no command range of himself. So taking out this banner bearer would make a huge difference, because without him, the other models will flee. Models that are behind cover, which this banner bearer is behind cover, counting as both from the dice and his friendly model, get to make a defense dice save. So, defense dice mean after I've rolled my to hit, where I get a simple success, because both 4 and 5 hit on these mercenaries, this banner bearer would roll a defense dice. With a defense dice, you need a roll of equal value to cancel out your opponent's rolls. No matter how many simple successes that these arquebusiers roll, if I roll also a simple success, it will cancel out all of these dice. So we'll say that banner bearer has managed his cover save. Let's go back, rewind, and say instead, this arquebusier decided to target this capo here. This capo here is clearly out in the open and an excellent target for an arquebusier. Let us say that while firing, the arquebusier rolled a Fortitudo crit. A Fortitudo crit success means that you further raise the targeted model's armor save by +1. This +1 on top of the +2 of the arquebus raises the knight's armor save of 2 plus to a 5 plus. Or let us say he crit succeeded with audacity. Audacity means that your troops have been so audacious in their fire, so scary, so intimidating, that beyond the actual effect of the bullets themselves, seeing your men rain down that kind of fire has made your opponents even more wary. So on a audacity crit, you'll roll another d6 in addition to your hit. On a value of 4 or more of that roll, your opponent must automatically burn a virtue without even having failed an armor save. If the model then fails their armor save, they must burn another virtue. With a Claritas crit after shooting, that model could make a 3-inch move. For example, if he were to make that shot and then decide he wanted to scuttle behind cover to avoid return fire, that would be an option. Now for the crit fails. On a Prudencia crit fail, that would mean that a capo within whose command range the target is would rally, meaning return a burnt virtue to the fresh status for free. For an audacity crit failure, your own troops must burn a virtue. You must burn the virtue off a capo within whose command range the firing model is. A Fortitudo crit fail means that you must gain an additional reload token for the model that fired the shot. The most dangerous crit fail in shooting is perhaps the speed crit fail. In his hastiness to take a shot, that model has committed an act of friendly fire and shot a friendly model within 3 inches of them. Resolve a hit as if you were shooting at that model, same as normal. Also important for shoot actions, you cannot make a shoot action if the model attempting to make the shoot action is in base-to-base contact with an enemy model. You can also not target enemy models that are in base-to-base contact with friendly models. Next, I'd like to cover fight activations with you. Fight activations work the following way. Now, for a fight activation, your troops must be within reach with their weapons. Here you see that mercenaries are usually equipped with either pikes or halberds. Halberds have a reach of 1, and pikes have a reach of 2. Now that means that pikes can reach 2 inches. And halberds can reach 1. That means that here in this case, as this capo here is armed with a sword and dagger, instead of a weapon with higher reach, he would currently not be able to reach these 2 models. So we would make a movement activation to get him within reach. I will then have to make a movement action. He will make a movement action with speed and audacity. He gets a speed crit. When moving into range with your weapon, you must move towards the nearest model. So now, these 2 models are engaged with this capo. However, that was this player's activation. It is now the Swiss player's turn to make an activation. They will make a fight activation. Now, there is one special rule about movement and fighting. If a model's previous activation was a movement activation, you may reuse the virtues and faith that you use for that movement activation for a fight activation if your next activation is a fight activation. This represents your model charging in and making an attack as he charges. So, the Swiss player here would declare a fight activation. The condottieri player here with the capo with the sword and dagger would then respond by declaring a fight activation too. This is a reaction that a player may make to a fight activation if they have sufficient virtue, faith, and or actions in order to make an activation. Now, this brings us to rally activations. In this case, our condottieri knight here with 2 celerity and 1 prudence has had 2 virtue burnt in the previous activation. In order to return these tokens from a burnt state to a usable fresh state, we must make a rally activation. Now, troops that are in base-to-base contact with enemy models cannot make rally activations. Luckily, however, capos can make rally activations for other capos who lie within their command range. So this banner bearer has a 6-inch command range. So this condottieri here is very much within his command range. So he will make a rally activation. When you make a rally activation, you roll a die for every virtue that is attached to that capo card. This capo card has 6 virtues attached to him. Any successes that he rolls, he may then use to rally virtue, meaning to return burnt virtue to a fresh state for his friend over there. I will roll 6 dice. It is important to note that rallying requires an action to do from the model. However, it does not require any virtue. Even if a capo has all their virtue burnt, they can still make a rally activation as long as they have actions remaining. So we will make a roll, and we have managed to roll on our 6 dice 3 successes. This would rally back 3 burnt virtue. The banner bearer has no burnt virtue himself, so that 3rd virtue is somewhat useless in this case. But he uses it to restore those 2 virtue to fresh. Important to note is fresh virtue must be burnt first, before spent virtue. This means that if you have, say, run up a hill into a hail of crossbow fire, spending 2 virtue, and you have 1 virtue remaining to bring you that last little distance, to bring you either into combat or into cover, and you are shot at by said crossbowman, and you have a virtue or more burnt, those models of yours charging up the hill will be stranded in the middle of the hill milling around confused and disheartened, open to more fire. So it is important to make sure that you have virtue to spare for just such occasions, or else you are running a risk of your troops getting confused and demoralized in the worst of all moments. The next activation that I want to discuss with you is reloading. After a model has made a shoot action, there will be often a reload necessary. On the weapon card is also noted its reload value. In this case, it's an arquebus with a reload value of 2. To reload, you spend as many virtue as you wish to, within, of course, your faith and the available virtue. In this case, this capo will order this arquebusier to reload using 2 virtue dice. Now, in this case, the virtue dice do not have a crit success or crit fail result specific to the virtues for a reload action, so we will just roll these 2 dice. Reload actions are somewhat simpler than other actions. On a result of 1, so counting as a crit fail, you reload nothing. Of a result of 2 to 5, you reload 1 point. On a result of 6, you reload 2 points. Once there are no more reload points on a model, it may use its weapon again. Force of Virtue is a game also very much revolving around objectives and interacting with the environment around you. Here we have an objective, a dead body, and we have a capo here who wishes to interact with the objective marker. Let's say for the sake of it, in our game we have decided there is a message hidden on this dead body that both sides wish to recover. So they must search the dead body in order to find the message, retrieve it, and bring it back to their employers. This is what we consider an interaction. You have 2 forms of interactions. You have easy interactions and hard interactions. When you roll an interaction, you roll 6 dice for a capo, or 3 dice for a troop. There are 2 kinds of interactions: easy interactions and hard interactions. Easy interactions require what we call a straight of 3 numbers. So if this capo were to roll his 6 dice, we would check and try to find a sequence. In this case, for example, 5, 6. We would put aside these dice for subsequent actions or rounds, and he would continue to roll for each activation he spends making an interaction with the objective. We would roll 6 dice, and we would add on to that straight. Here you see I have rolled a 1, a 2, and a 3. As you see, you can do what we call wrap around, where it goes 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. Once there is a straight significant enough to accomplish whether a easy objective of 3 or a hard objective of 6, the objective is considered complete. Some models have advantages doing certain types of interactions. Say, if this was a convince interaction, the Duchess would roll an extra 3 dice on top of her normal 6 dice. Such other models that are not capos would only roll 3 dice for an interaction. As you see from the idea of a convince interaction that the Duchess is better at, we divide interactions into types. Convince, investigate, search, construct, destroy. These will be defined in your scenario, what you are trying to do to the objective. Force of Virtue is a game of small bands of mercenaries fighting small, highly personal missions, raids, assaults, assassination attempts. It's not all out, all or nothing, fights to the end. These people are professionals. They know that they need to make a living and come back. So, as such, in a game of Force of Virtue, you can normally gain 2 victory points. 1 victory point for achieving the objective, 1 victory point for ending the game with 50% of your troops still alive. If your troops have fled the board due to not having fresh virtue nearby them not being within the command range of a capo, etc., they don't count as dead. They count as fled. If you meet them in the pub afterwards, they're not dead. Each of those victory points in a normal campaign mode would give you 1 more card that you can take out of your company deck and add into your warband deck. That's representing your warband leader amassing opportunities and advantages as he is more and more successful. That objective allowed him to either gain riches or a strategic advantage or an intrigue advantage. As your warband deck grows, you can then decide also what those street cards actually did. If you wanted some added spice, after you choose the objective, you can randomly draw a card for your company deck to help you build the narrative of the objective. Sometimes that gives you a bit of an idea of what it did. Considering you get 1 victory point for ending the game with 50% of your forces intact, you can do what is called sounding the retreat. At the beginning or end of your round, you may sound the retreat instead of passing. This means that all your troops drop their weapons and immediately flee. This can help you preserve your forces above the 50% mark. Also, it means that you will then be able to get in another game with your opponent and have some more fun. In Force of Virtue, for us, it's very important that you get in more games. For us, we don't want you to be playing a game for an extra 20 minutes just because you know it's a foregone conclusion. Your warband leader wouldn't stick around for his men to be slaughtered, neither should you. Before we get into scenarios, we're going to go into force creation. Force creation is where you build your warband. Force of Virtue is a game which has many different types of campaign that you can play with it, but you can also play one-off pickup games with it. For your force creation, you use the decks. When you are creating your deck, or so-called company deck, you may use up to 3 decks. These 3 decks can include up to 2 nation decks. You may also draw cards from a scenario deck. Those 3 decks can be nation or character decks. You also may draw from a scenario deck, but you may only have a maximum of 2 nation decks in your company deck, or just deck. From these 3 decks, you would draw in a campaign what is called your warband. Now, from your warband, you would draw your hand. In Force of Virtue, we always play to a hand size. That is how many cards we are taking to the game. This is the first aspect of scenario generation, of course, which we will cover next. When you are making your hand, you may only have a maximum of 50% logistics cards in your hand, rounding up. This is just to make sure that you get use out of all the fun honor cards and intrigue cards and strategic cards that we also have in our decks. I'm here with Fintan to talk about a little bit about scenario generations. Fintan has been playtesting with us. So what we're going to be talking about is, again, scenario generation. Now, the first step of generating a scenario is deciding the play mode. What do we mean by this? The play mode is whether you decide with your opponent whether you're doing a cooperative game or a competitive game. For a cooperative game, both players are mainly interested in generating a story and finding out what happens and are happy to be a little bit forgiving and looser on rules. If you want a competitive game, you both players know to expect a head-on battle of wits, no holds barred, test of generalship, rules as written. First step we find to an enjoyable game is knowing what to expect and which one both people are interested in. I was thinking of a light cooperative game today, Fintan. What were you thinking?
I think that sounds good to me.
The first step in generating the scenario itself is rolling the objective. So we will be rolling on a D3 to find out how the objective is situated. This could be one objective in the middle, multiple objectives spread out. We'll consult the table. I roll my dice and I will get a result of 1, which means that the objective is positioned. It means that I will have to set up a board with the objective in the center. One central objective that everybody goes head to head on. That objective in the center also means that the one objective is a hard interaction. The next step is setting up the board. So I'll take a moment to set up a board for us to play. You will have to be careful, however, because if you set up the board, your opponent then gets to choose the deployment type. Here you see I have set up the board. Now, your opponent gets to choose the deployment zone first. So if you set it up weirdly, you might end up being the one advancing into gun lines instead of the one nicely positioned behind cover surveying a vast open field. Now you see, I have set up the board, and I think I've done a fairly good job at making an even, easy board to use. Now we have to roll to see what the deployment type is. We'll roll a dice and consult the chart. 1. That is a position deployment. This means that one player will deploy within 4 inches of the central objective, the defender specifically, and they will be preventing the attacker from trying to achieve the objective, i.e. make a successful interaction with the objective. Once a successful interaction is made with the objective, then the game is over. And the person who has made the interaction has achieved the objective and will receive the victory points for that. Important. In a normal game of Force of Virtue, you can achieve 2 victory points. 1 victory point for achieving the objective, and 1 victory point for finishing the game with more than 50% of your force still alive. Any troops that fled because of burnt virtue also count as alive. Now I've set up the board. Now I must also declare to Fintan, because since I set up, Fintan gets to choose what the different terrain types are, what is difficult terrain, what is impassable terrain. Now, so Fintan can make an informed choice. I will say the doors are passable as normal. These walls are impassable. Crossing these embankments with the trees counts as difficult, and the barrels count as cover. Crossing the cart counts as difficult terrain. Knowing that, Finton will choose whether he wants to be the attacker or the defender in this scenario.
In this scenario, I think I'm going to pick to be the attacker.
Now that's interesting. So I will deploy within 4 inches of the objective and try and prevent Finton from making a hard interaction with the objective. Now at this point, we try and craft a narrative. Now either I've got one in my head that works well, all interaction types are the same, so it doesn't really matter what I choose. However, we now know what the deployment is and stuff. We could also consult our chart. However, other than consult the chart in the rulebook, I think I already have a good idea. We have a dead body. We have my guys around it. We could either say that I've just murdered this person and Finton is trying to retrieve evidence that it was my men who murdered him and take it to the Duke or the Pope and get my guys in trouble. Or we could say that my men were hired to protect this poor unlucky individual, and one of Finton's men managed to snipe him from one of these buildings, and you are now trying to extract a message or some kind of element from the body. Maybe you're trying to finish him off. What would you say?
I think that he could still be alive, and I've been trying to kill him. He was my target. I've been paid to kill him. So
he's wounded, the job is somewhat botched, and you want to make sure it's done, cut off his head and bring it to your employer.
Yes.
Excellent. So now that we have set up, decided deployment, we're now ready to decide also what cards we're going to take. But before we decide what cards we're going to take, we have to decide what hand size we're going to play this game to. We're currently playing a narrative campaign, all of us. Each of us have warbands. I currently have a warband size of 18 cards with my Swiss. Finton currently has been playing his a little longer and has 23. In the case of a difference in warband size, the player with a smaller warband gets to decide what hand size we're playing to. Let's make it a 14 card game. Is that okay by you?
That sounds fun to me.
I could also choose a hand size slightly higher than I have and choose up to 3 additional scenario cards from the scenario deck in order to kind of pad it out and bring it up to a higher number if Finton wanted to play a larger game. I can choose from my cards in my warband, I can choose my hand, and if I wanted to switch out cards that are in my warband for cards in the scenario deck, I could do that too. Now we would go through and we would pick our cards for this game. Once we pick the cards, we would deploy the troops. Now, before we do our deployments, or the pre-deployment shenanigans that come from our cards, we're going to do what is called a scenario deck draft. We will draw 6 cards. We have an ambush card. We have another ambush card. We have barricades. We have an assassin. And we have more barricades. And as our final card, we have a banker. The attacker, since he chooses the timing of the attack, gets and has a slight disadvantage in he's trying to achieve something and I just have to stop him. The attacker always gets first pick of the draft.
Take these cards and take my pick of them.
Go.
I think it would make sense, narratively, for me to take this assassin.
That makes a lot of sense. And as it's a cooperative game, that also helps the narrative. I think it makes sense that I've got barricades. Your pick again?
Yes, I will take a look through here. I think perhaps I'm going to take this ambush card, as my men are already positioned inside of a building nearby.
Maybe that's where the sniper came. I will take the second barricades.
I will take the second ambush.
And I will take the banker. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with him, but I'll figure it out. Now we would both play any cards marked pre-deployment and start our deployment proper. The defender starts to deploy first, and then the attacker deploys afterwards. The attacker then gets first turn. So for each barricade card, I would get to place 9 inches of barricade. For now, we're not going to play through a full game. There's more than enough games on our channel that you can see us play through. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully that's enough for you to get started with your own game of Force of Virtue.